Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Python for Absolute Beginner series. In this episode, we're going to cover something called functions. Although you may not recognize what functions are just yet, we've actually used them a ton in the past couple of episodes. If you recall, to print something out, we would just type print, then parentheses, and then type whatever we wanted to within inside these parentheses. What about when we have, let's say, a variable, let's say x equals 5, and we want to check the type of it when we write type of x? Or how about, like in the last episode, when we used the input function like this to prompt the user to enter some number? These three lines of code, this print statement, this type statement, and this input statement, are all what we call functions. So functions are essentially blocks of code that can be called, or in other words, run, by typing their name followed by parentheses. These three functions here that we've used are all built-in functions in Python, meaning they simply come with the Python programming language. A function call is when we type the name of the function followed by parentheses. So this line up here would be calling the print function, this line right here is calling the type function, and this line right here is calling the input function. Functions can take in what are called arguments, and these are what we put inside the parentheses of a function call. So for example, this print function takes in one argument, which is a string, in this case, hello world. Even though it can be any number of words long, it's still only one argument because it's one string. We only pass in one value or variable to type, meaning that it also has only one argument, and the same is true for input. It just has a string as its one argument. But there are functions where you need to pass in more than one argument. One example would be the pow function. This function is written something like this. We would write pow, let's say 5, 2, and it basically returns us 5 to the power of 2. In this example, we're passing in two arguments and they're both ints. Anytime you pass in more than one argument, you separate the arguments with a comma. So these built-in functions are great and can hopefully give you an idea of how functions work. But this isn't necessarily why functions are important in Python. Functions are important because in Python you can write your own functions, and the point of writing your own functions is to not have to repeat code over and over again. So let's say that for whatever reason we want to print out a greeting message that has a couple of different print lines in it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and start fresh. Let's say we want to have a line that says print, let's just say hello user. And you want to have another line that's another print statement, and we're going to say, how are you doing today? And then we'll have another one that'll say, it is very nice outside this afternoon. And then we'll have one more that'll say, do you have any plans for the day? So what if we wanted to run this code, let's say 3 times? It would be super annoying if every time we wanted to run it, we had to copy and paste it like this. So we don't want to have something like this, where if we run it 3 times, we literally copy and paste it 3 times. The solution to this problem would instead to write a function, maybe just call it greeting, that had these lines of code inside of it. Then, whenever we wanted to display these greeting lines, we would just call the greeting function once and it would do it all for us. So let's actually do that. So I'm going to go to the very top of this page here and I'm going to write a function. So first we write def followed by a space and then our function name. So we'll just do greeting and then parentheses. And then just like we did for conditionals and loops, we'll type a colon and indent to let the computer know that we're now inside this function. And inside this function now, I'm just going to cut and paste this code. I'll make sure to re-indent this so it looks something like this. So when writing functions in Python, we always start them with def. And def is just short for define, because the actual code of the function is called the definition of the function. So all of this here is just the function definition. So then we write the name of our function, whatever we want it to be, and then followed by parentheses. And note that we have to have parentheses right after our function name, even if we don't put anything inside them. And I'll explain what these parentheses actually do in just a moment. Then, just like the loops and conditionals, we put a colon, so we know that the following lines are going to be indented. So note that this function doesn't actually run any of this code until we call it. So because we just have this function definition here, if we run this block here, we'll see that nothing actually happens. So we'll give it a second, and you'll see the code is complete and it doesn't print out anything. And that's because I'm just defining this function, I'm not actually calling it. So let's actually call this function now. So to call it, we would use the same type of syntax that we did when calling any other function. So below here, I'm just going to type greeting with parentheses. And again, we need parentheses when calling a function, so make a note to never forget these. Putting the parentheses right after the function name is how the computer knows that we're referring to a function. Let's run this code chunk, and then now you'll see that it prints out all these lines of code. And now, anytime we want to output these lines of code, we can just call the greeting function. So let's test this a few more times. Let's clear this output here, and I'm going to call it, let's say 2 more times. And I'll just write greeting again here, and then greeting again here. And if you run it this time, it's kind of cluttered here, but you can see it printed this off 3 times. So here's the first time, here's the second time, and here is the third time. So pretty neat, huh? This allows us to avoid having to duplicate all of our code over and over again. We just write it once inside of a function, and then whenever we want to use it, we can simply just call the function. So just to quickly reiterate what we just learned, functions are some block of code like this that you can define on your own. Whenever you want to use that code, you can just call it by typing the function name and parentheses. Where you actually write the function itself, right here, is called the function definition, hence why we use the keyword def when defining it. When you actually run the function code like this is called the function call. So let's move on to arguments now. So I mentioned with our built-in functions like print, when we would pass in arguments, we would do something like this, right? Inside the parentheses, we would write hello world. And this hello world string here represents an argument that we're passing in. So what if we want our own self-defined functions to have arguments? To add that, we add these arguments within the parentheses in the actual function definition and inside the function call. So inside of our function definition, let's just make an argument, and let's call it arg1, and that'll just be short for argument 1. And then I'm going to change this body here. I'm going to delete most of this. I'll actually delete this too, clear this output. So inside of here, I actually just want to print arg1. And then I want to call this greeting function. So I'm going to call greeting, and I'm going to pass in hello world. And then if we run this code now, you'll see that it prints out hello world. So let's say I want to call it again. Let's do another greeting call, and let's just pass in hello YouTube. And if we run it again, you'll see it prints out both hello world and hello YouTube. So here's what's happening. So every time that we call this function, we pass in one argument, in this instance, hello world, and this argument is represented by arg1 in the function body. So when we call a greeting, I can pass in whatever argument I want, and our function will print it out. The number of arguments in your function call, like this, should always be equal to the number of arguments in your function definition here. So our function definition has one argument, arg1, so our function call needs to only have one argument, no more, no less. If I change our definition here to have 2 arguments, let's say arg1 and arg2, and I try to run this, I'm actually going to get an error here because we're only passing in 1 argument when the definition is expecting 2. And let's try the reverse. Let's make this have only 1 argument, but I'm going to pass in 2 arguments to the call. And that will also give me an error because the number of arguments in the function definition is not equal to the number of arguments in the function call. So long story short, always match the number of arguments in the definition with the number of arguments in the call. So I'll go ahead and delete this here so we can fix it, run it again, and you'll see everything is back to normal. If we have multiple arguments, the order of the arguments is extremely important. So let's say in our greeting function, we now have 3 arguments. Let's have arg1, arg2, and arg3. And inside of this print statement, I'm going to change it a little bit here. I'm going to write arg1 is equal to, and I'll tell you what this means in just a second, how I'm doing this little print statement here. I'll write arg2 is equal to arg2, and then we're going to print arg3 is equal to, arg3. So basically, the way I'm writing these print statements here, you might notice there's a comma here, which is a little bit confusing because we just said print statements have 1 argument, but essentially what we're doing here is we're just combining a string and a variable in the same sentence so that we can print them out together, and I'll show you what it outputs in just a second. So now in our function call, in our function definition, we have 3 arguments. So in our function call, we need to pass in 3 arguments. So let's delete this. And let's say we want to pass in 3 numbers. Let's just say 5, 7, and 3. And if we run this code, you'll see that it says arg1 is equal to 5, arg2 is equal to 7, and arg3 is equal to 3. And this order happens because when we call the function, the order of arguments matters. The first value passed in our case 5, is going to get assigned to arg1. The second one passed in, which is 7, is going to get assigned to arg2. The third one passed in arg3 is going to get assigned to arg3. So the order matches up exactly, and it's always going to be that way. So if I wanted, let's say 7 to be arg1, I would have to change the order to have 7 here and 5 here because it translates directly the order. So 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. And if we print it out here, you'll see it now says arg1 is equal to 7, arg2 is equal to 5, and arg3 is equal to 3. And while we're here, now is a super good time to mention something important. So the reason I wrote this function at the top of the page and not the bottom or anywhere else is because a function has to be defined before it is called. So remember that Python is pretty strict about running its code in order, so we need to have function definitions at the top of the page. If I call a function before it's defined, let's say I have something up here and I'm calling greeting up at the top, let's just pass in 652, and I try to run it, I'm going to get an error because at this point, the code doesn't know that this function actually exists yet because we haven't reached that line. So when we call this function greeting, it's going to throw an error. So just make sure that you always define functions at the top of the page so you can avoid errors, and it'll save you a lot of time when troubleshooting. So the last important thing that I want to go over with functions is return values. So right now in our function, all we're doing is basically writing a couple of different print statements. But what if we actually wanted to do some math or some other operations inside a function and then assign that to a variable somewhere else in our code? And that's where our return statement comes in. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this function. Actually, I'm going to delete this whole code block here. I'm going to make a new code block so we can start fresh. And I want a new scenario here. So let's say I want a function that will return the square of a number. So if I pass in 3, let's say to the function, it should give me back 9. If I pass in 4, the function should give me back 16. And if I pass in 5, for instance, the function should give me back 25 and so forth. So let's write a function called square number. So I'm going to write def, let's say square number, and then I'll write parentheses. And inside of these, I'm just going to pass in one argument, and I'll just call it x. And then I'll write the colon here, indent. And to get the square of a number, we know that we need to multiply a number by itself. So I'm going to take our argument x and just multiply it by itself. So I'm just going to write x times x. Now we need some way to get this result back to our code whenever it is called. And that's where we write a return statement. So before this x times x here, I'm going to write return. So I'll show you how this actually works now. So let's actually call this function down here. Let's write square number, and then we're going to pass in 5. And if we run this, you'll see that it outputs 25. So what's happening is we call this square number function here, right? And then we pass in 5 as an argument. Now, when you look at the function definition, we're basically just passing in 5 to this x argument, and then we're just returning 5 times 5. So when we call this, that's why it outputs 25. So let's actually make a variable now so we can store this. Let's make a new one called my variable, and let's set it equal to this. And then now if we do it like this, it's not going to print anything out because we're just doing a variable assignment. But now we're going to store the value 25 inside of my var. So now if we just print my var, it should print out 25. The important thing to know here is that this return statement basically specifies that we're just storing x times x within the function call. So whenever we call square number 5, this is now storing the value 25. If we were to call square number 4, this function call would be now storing the value 16. So this return statement basically just tells us what we're going to actually store in the results of the function call when we're actually calling it. Let's do another quick example so you can kind of get the idea of how this return statement works. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this output and delete all this. And I want to write another function called sum3values. So I'm going to write def, let's say sum3values, and then parentheses. And then we're just going to pass in, let's say 3 arguments. Let's say x, y, and z, and that's because we're going to be summing 3 values together, so we're going to pass in 3 arguments. Then I'm just going to do a colon, indent, and inside of here, I'm just going to write return x plus y plus z. Then, down here, let's actually call this function. So we just defined sum 3 values, now I want to call it, so we type the name, and then parentheses, and then let's say we want to pass in, let's just do 5, 5, and 5. And if we run this, you'll see that it outputs 15. So we can return literally whatever we want from a function, and this return value is always going to get stored in the function call. So if we want to access the return value, we can grab it by doing this. And one important note here is that we should only ever have one return statement in a function. So we don't want to have, like, say, return x plus z. Now, if we do this, we actually won't get an error. You'll see it still outputs 15, because basically it's going to return at the very first return line that it sees. So it's just going to return here, and it's going to completely ignore this line. But the general statement of truth for writing functions is that we don't want to have multiple return statements. We just want to have one, because we can only ever return one value from a return statement. So at this point, I want to summarize what we've done so far. So far, you've learned what some of the built-in Python functions are, how we can make our own functions to prevent repeated code, how we can call our own functions, and how we can return values from these functions. To solidify your understanding a bit more, let's do a practice problem. For this practice problem, let's say we have a list that has all ints. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this, make a new code block here. So we're going to have a list that has all ints. So let's say we'll just call it my list, and let's just do 5, 2, 9, and 6. And our goal is to write a function that can find the highest number out of this list. If our function works correctly, it should end up outputting 9, because 9 is the highest number out of this list. So how can we solve this? We'll want to have a variable called max, or maximum, that can store the maximum value. At the end of our function logic, we'll want to return that max. So how do we find this max? Well, we can loop through all these numbers using a for loop and then find our max that way. So let's get to writing. Let's make some room up here, and we'll go ahead and define our function. So let's write def, and we'll just call this function find max, and we're going to pass in one argument, let's say list var, and this will just be short for list variable. And then we'll do the colon and indent. And I said that we want to have a max variable that we can return at the very end. So let's make a new variable called maximum, and we'll just say start it at 0 for the sake of this code. So then we want to use a for loop that we learned last episode. So our list is represented by the argument list var. So let's loop through that list. So let's say for number in list var. We'll just do the indentation here. And then what do we want to do now? So at every item in this list, what do we actually need to accomplish? So we want to compare the current value in the list to our maximum value. If the current value in the list is greater than the maximum, then this current value should become the new maximum. And we can write that exactly like this. So I'll write an if statement, and we'll say if number is greater than maximum, and like I said, number represents each individual element in this list variable. So that would represent like a 5 or a 2 or a 9 or a 6. So if the number is greater than the existing maximum, then what do? Then we should update the maximum to equal this number. If the current number is not greater than the maximum, we can keep the current maximum where it's at, so we don't need to do anything and we can continue the loop. The last thing we need to do is to return the maximum. So let's make a new line here, and let's write return maximum. And notice how I make this return statement at the same indentation level as the function. So we want to make sure that this return is not inside the if or inside the for, because if it was like this, then we're doing something entirely different because it's inside the if statement. And if we're doing it like this, we're doing something entirely different because it's inside the for loop. So what we want to do is have it outside here at the main level of indentation of the rest of the function. So now let's try calling this function and actually testing it out. So we have this new variable down here that we set earlier, my list, and we set it equal to 5, 2, 9, and 6. So let's just make, let's say we're going to just call this here, and then we're going to do find max, and we're going to pass in our list. And if we run it, you'll see that it outputs 9. So we pass in this list, in other words 5296, to this function here. This function runs all of its logic and it returns the number that it finds that is represented as the maximum. Let's try changing this list around to different numbers just to test out this functionality. Let's do 4, 3, 2, and 1. If we run it, you'll see the maximum is 4. Let's do 25, 10, 27, 50. And if you run it, you'll see it outputs 50. And we'll do it one more. We'll just do, let's say 7, 15, 12, and 6. And you'll see it outputs 15. Now I should quickly note that this function is actually pretty much completely obsolete because there's actually a built-in function in Python called max that does this exact same thing. So we actually don't need to actually really write this out, but I just wanted to kind of give you this as an example so you can see how this worked. So like the actual built-in Python function, we would do max of my list like this, and it would still print out 15 because it runs pretty much the exact same logic. I just wanted to do this so I could show you guys kind of how the code is working within inside the function. So I'll go ahead and change this call back to our function here, findMax. And then what I really want to do now is just kind of show you how this function works if you're having trouble maybe understanding it. So this might look super daunting because we have a whole lot of indentation going on and kind of happening here all at once. So if it confuses you, just try and break it down line by line and I'll go ahead and follow along with that. So first with this line, we're just defining a function and we're calling it findMax. And here we're just passing in one argument, which is listVar. So then we're creating a variable called maximum. And for the sake of this code, we're just setting it equal to 0. And this maximum is going to be what we want to return at the very end of the function. Then we take the argument that we have, listVar, and we loop through every single item in that list. And at each item, we check. We say, hey, is this current number greater than the existing maximum? If it is, let's update the maximum to be this new number. And then if it's not, nothing else happens, so we go to the next iteration of the loop. And this keeps going and going and going until it finds the maximum and it stores it, and then it returns the maximum. And then when we call this findMax function, it stores the maximum in this function call. So now let's actually trace this step by step using the list that we pass in. So when we call findMax on my list, here's what happens. So we look at the function definition and we start with maximum equals 0. So we're making a new variable maximum and setting it equal to 0. And then we're going to start to loop through all of the items in the list that we pass in as an argument. So in this case, the list that we pass in as listVar was 7, 5, 12, and 6. So the start of this for loop is going to start at the number 7. So we say, is 7 greater than 0? Yes, it is. So we're going to set the maximum equal to 7. Then we go back to this for loop and we say, is 15 greater than 7? Because 7 is the new maximum. 15 is greater than 7, so we update the maximum to equal 15. We go back to the for loop, and then we say, is 12 greater than 15? Because 15 is now the new maximum. We say, no, 12 is not greater than 15, so we just continue. And then we hit 6, we say, is 6 greater than 15? No, it isn't, so we just continue. But now the for loop is done, so we unindent and go back to this return maximum, and 15 is in maximum, so that's what we return. So that's why when we run this call, findMaxMyList, we get 15. And just like I mentioned before, it should be a general rule of thumb that you always have the return statement at the same indentation level as the rest of the function and not inside another for statement or an if statement. Because for instance, if I had it like this and I tried to run it, it would return 7, which is not correct. And if I did it like this, it would also return 7, which is not correct. So we need to make sure it's outside of any for loop or while loop or conditional statement. And it's just at the same indentation level as the rest of the function, and it'll run properly. Hopefully now you should have a decent understanding of how functions work in Python. We learned built-in functions, how to make your own functions, how we can call our own functions, how we can use arguments, and how we can return values from our functions. Like always, I'd strongly encourage you to hop into your own Google Colab notebook and just mess around with these, because the absolute best way to learn is by trying it yourself. Our next video, episode 7, will be the last primary video in the series, and that's where we'll cover classes. After that, we'll do one wrap-up video that contains some summaries in the outlook moving forward. Take care everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.